Benjamin Steer. He's an assistant professor of anthropology and the director of Cherokee Studies at Western North Carolina University. He's been conducting archaeological research in Western North Carolina since 2004. Recently, he collaborated on a project with the Eastern Band of Cherokee, for which he was honored with the Principal Chief D. Leon Jones Award for Archaeological Excellence. Dr. Steer spoke with my classes last year, and we thoroughly enjoyed his presentation. It's my pleasure to welcome him again to UNCA.
All right. Hey guys, thank you first of all very much to Jessica for inviting me back for a second round. It's actually really nice to get to come back and give a talk. I was here almost exactly 1 year ago and spent most of the drive home thinking about things I would have done differently if I had a chance to do this talk again. So it's actually really cool to get a chance to do this talk again. Can you guys all hear me okay? Everything's good? It's also a pretty exciting drive over Balsam Gap and Swannanoa Gap today. There was a lot of green stuff on the ground, so I've had my adrenaline rush for today, so I'm ready to go. My talk today is titled, What Mounds Mean? Insights from Collaborative Archaeology in the Cherokee Heartland. And I want to thank Jessica also for a very, very kind introduction. I am indeed an archaeologist. I'll talk a little bit about my background. What I want to do today is give you some sort of general knowledge, general information about the long-term history of the cultural landscape here in Western North Carolina. You guys have been here in Asheville for at least a month, if you're fall semester freshmen, possibly longer. So you'll leave today with some more information about sort of the long-term history, the indigenous heritage of your own backyard here. What I also want to do is reflect on the very good questions that I got here 1 year ago today when I gave this talk. When people were very interested in, what do these mounds mean today? What does this indigenous heritage mean today? How does the archaeology here in Cherokee, how does the preservation of sacred sites here in Cherokee today connect with broader issues in tribal self-determination? How does this connect with things like the Dakota Access Pipeline? How does this connect with things like the conflict over Bear Ears Monument? And the truth is that some very similar conflicts, potential issues are in fact happening in our backyard, perhaps not as spectacularly as happened with the Dakota Access Pipeline, perhaps they're not as high profile as Bear Ears Monument, but there are some intersections. And so I hope to talk about those today as well. That sound good? And I've got cool pictures of mounds, right? Okay, very good. Well, let's get to the cool pictures. Let me see. Go old school here. Okay, so here we go. For those of you who are here for extra credit and need to have things you learned today, there you go. You can write that down if you need to identify some things you learned today. So my talk here has 2 points. First of all, I am going to talk about archaeology. So how can archaeology and also Cherokee ethnography help us understand this cultural landscape, especially the built environment, the prehistoric and historic built environment in Western North Carolina? And then the second point, the one that I thought about when driving home back to Silva a year ago, Cherokee mounds, Cherokee towns, this prehistoric built environment, it still matters today. It's still important. It's still contentious. There are competing narratives over what these places mean. There's competing narratives, competing ideas over how these places should be preserved. And so I want to talk about those today. Okay. So how did I get here? I'm a North Carolinian. I'm originally from Durham, North Carolina. I went to Wake Forest University for my undergrad and graduated in 2003. So if you're good at math, you can probably figure out how old I am. And after graduating from Wake Forest, I fell into a really cool job. I became an archaeological field technician. Archaeological field technicians are also lovingly called shovel bums. And we are the people who actually do sort of the on-the-ground work of archaeology. Most of the archaeology done in the United States today is called cultural resource management archaeology. It's not necessarily pure academic research. It's archaeology done in advance of things like construction projects, federal road widening projects. And I landed on one of these jobs in Cherokee, North Carolina. And this is a photograph from what I sort of know as the Ravenford site, and what a lot of people in my part of the world know as the new Cherokee High School. So I worked on the archaeology for what became the new Cherokee K-12 high school. This is actually the largest archaeological excavation in North Carolina history. The Eastern Band contracted an archaeological company, TRC, to excavate 40 acres of floodplain that would later become the new Cherokee High School. And so this is what it looks like today. This is what it looked like then. This is us excavating the remains of a burned 18th century Cherokee house. And as you can see here, you know, we've got visitors today at the site. This is back in 2004. These are students from the Cherokee Advanced Placement History class that had come to learn about the archaeology site. This photograph's a cool artifact. You can tell it's before smartphones because they're not all doing this, right? They're like actually looking at the ground and not their phones. So that's kind of nice. But while I was there, while I was there working in Cherokee, I became really interested in this idea of indigenous archaeology and collaborative archaeology. So archaeology that's done by, for, with, and about Native American people. As a student at Wake Forest, I really didn't have much interaction with Native American people at all. I really learned archaeology from a very sort of, you know, Western positivist kind of tradition. And so working in Cherokee gave me a very different take when, you know, the students who were visiting our site through the clan system, where there are 7 clans, you know, there's a 1 in 7 chance that these students were related to the people through clan membership who built these houses. That's very real, you know, and that's a very real thing. So that had a profound impact on me and really influenced the rest of my archaeological career. That Ravensford project, my mom likes to point out I was in the magazine. That's me right there. This was a high-profile project. It got a lot of, you know, good publicity, and the Eastern Band, you know, as early as 2009, was really being recognized for sort of, you know, as the magazine article reads here, embracing archaeology, thinking about archaeology as a way to, in some ways, own their own past, to sort of, you know, have a stake, have some ownership in how archaeology was done, and have a greater role in writing their own history. Today, the Tribal Historic Preservation Office of the Eastern Band is one of the most active in the country. They actively coordinate with people on research projects. They also have a really cool logo where they've got this Mississippian gorget here, which includes an eagle dancer or eagle warrior holding a severed head. That's pretty cool for a government logo. You don't get a lot of severed heads on government logos, but it lets you know the THPO means business. I went to graduate school. After graduate school, I sort of wandered back up to Cherokee and began working on these collaborative projects with the Eastern Band. Some of the work that I'll present today is from a postdoc I did in consultation with the Tribal Historic Preservation Office to try and go out and understand poorly understood mound sites. And since then, especially since 2011, I've worked on these collaborative projects with the Eastern Band that I think you can sort of fall under this window, or under this umbrella rather, sorry, of indigenous archaeology. Archaeology that's done by, for, and with indigenous communities. This is from a field school that my students and I ran back in 2014 on the Qualla boundary. Here's some of my students having fun digging square holes, and they're consulting with Jerry Wolf. Anybody ever heard of Jerry Wolf? A few folks. You should. Well, you are now. Jerry Wolf is a beloved man for the Eastern Band of Cherokee. That's an honorific title for Cherokee elders. Only the sort of most esteemed male elders get that beloved man title. They also have a beloved woman title, which is reserved for their most revered women elders. Jerry Wolf is in his 90s. He's a World War II D-Day vet, and has remarkable knowledge of Cherokee culture. He speaks the Cherokee language, and so my students were very lucky to have Jerry come out to our site. And in addition to sort of doing the scientific program of archaeology out here in Cherokee, they also learned about what this place meant from Jerry. We've incorporated stories that Jerry has told us into our interpretation of the site to try and get a richer, more holistic understanding of what this place means. Standing behind me here is my good friend and colleague, Bo Carroll. Bo Carroll is an enrolled member of the Eastern Band and is now a tribal archaeologist. He's got a master's degree from the University of Tennessee. And so Bo is now working with the THPO here, actively, taking a role in directing archaeology out in Cherokee. So it's very exciting for me to see indigenous people kind of coming up the ranks, coming through the academy and going back home where they can really have a say in how archaeology works. And I think that's really the future. That's where hopefully things are going to be headed for years to come. Okay, so here's bullet point 1 for those of you who are taking notes. Let's talk about the archaeology of the region and how we can use ethnography as well as archaeology to understand our local past. This is a photograph of the Gudua Mound taken in 1937. Has anybody ever been out to Gudua before? This is a very manageable day trip. I'm going to tell you how to get there. Gudua Mound is a very important place. This is the place of emergence for Cherokee. In Cherokee tradition, Gudua is known as the mother town. It's the town from which Cherokee emerged. Cherokee emerged here and were taught how to be people. They received knowledge about how to be people. You can go here. It's a real place. It's still there. Not many people in the world still have their place of origin intact. I mean, there's that direct link with oral history. This is where we're from. Since 1999, the Eastern Band have owned this land. They control this land. They have sovereign ownership of this place, and so this is their place. And so Gudua Mound is this place of emergence. We understand it archaeologically. There's been archaeological research done out there. We know when it was occupied. But it's also very important to understand why Gudua is important from a traditional Cherokee perspective. And you can get some insight there from Cherokee ethnography. This is Swimmer. Swimmer was a Cherokee elder who worked with the anthropologist James Mooney in the late 19th century to record the myths of the Cherokee. Swimmer's family still lives in Cherokee. They've been there since the 1800s. Amanda Swimmer is a famous Cherokee potter. You might be familiar with her work if you're into local pottery up here. But Swimmer told Mooney that from a Cherokee perspective, these mounds are very much living places. These are monumental constructions made of earth. I'll talk more about how these things are built here in a minute, but from a Cherokee perspective, these are living places. Mounds contain central fires that are considered to be everlasting, always burning. And in the late 1800s, Swimmer actually says to Mooney, some say this everlasting fire was only in the larger mounds at Niquosi and Gudua and a few other towns, and that when the new fire was drawn up for the Green Corn Dance, it was distributed from them to other settlements. And so every year at an annual harvest ceremony, the Green Corn Ceremony, which happens up here in October, it still happens. It's called the Fall Fair now, but it's still basically the Green Corn Ceremony. People would take coals from the fire inside the central townhouse at their central mound. They would extinguish their individual house fires and relight them with these fires that were taken from the central townhouse mound, creating a link between your center place, your major town, your mother town, and each individual household, sort of creating community through that act of sharing fire. When some members of the Eastern Band were removed to Oklahoma in 1838 on the Trail of Tears, they carried the fire with Gudua, from Gudua with them. They carried fire. They carried coals from that fire in a ceramic pot and took it all the way to Oklahoma. And they kept it burning. And when they rebuilt a new council house in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, they relit it with fire from Gudua. So you want to talk about connections, right? And how much that matters. I mean, so Oklahoma Cherokee maintained a connection, a physical connection to their homeland through that act of taking that fire over. So these mounds are incredibly important from a traditional Cherokee perspective because they're considered living places. They are a living link between past and present and future. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit now about what these big Native American earthen monuments mean on the landscape, how they were constructed, what they mean, and you're going to learn a lot about your backyard right now. So strap in and pay attention because this is like right here on the French Broad River. How many of you have been to Biltmore Estate? More hands going up. Yes, okay. It's a very big house. It's very impressive. I agree. It's a little over big, but there it is. I think the Biltmore Estate is really cool because it's got a mound on it. This is less publicized, but there it is. Biltmore Estate is home to the Biltmore Mound. On the south side of the Shenandoah River, there is a very low platform mound out there. It's barely perceptible because you have some sort of ridge and swale topography out there at Biltmore Estate. It's a very low rise. But there is, in fact, a low mound out there that dates to the Woodland period. This is between about AD 200 and 800. There was a low platform mound out there that was built as sort of a central gathering place for far-flung communities, people living as sort of semi-sedentary hunter-gatherers all through the French Broad and Shenandoah basins would have come together at what's now the Biltmore Estate for important annual gatherings. There's also an important Woodland period mound, a ceremonial center on Garden Creek off the West Fork of Pigeon River. This is near modern-day Canton. You smell Canton before you see it while you're driving on 40. Locals will tell you because of the paper factory there. But we've also got a major ceremonial center there. These are some of the earliest mounds in western North Carolina, and I've got some images here to show you what these things look like. This is a picture of the mound at Garden Creek while it was being excavated by archaeologists from the UNC in the 1960s. And you can see here you have this sort of low platform mound. This would have served as a platform for major public events. We've got lightly built structures that were built on top of this mound for important ceremonies. And at the Garden Creek Mound, archaeologists discovered, among other things, artifacts that are exotic. They're far away from western North Carolina. This is Ohio Flint Ridge chert. These are little chert stone bladelets that were made in Ohio and imported in, probably used for preparing medicine. They may have also been used for scarification and possibly some tattooing. That's another possible thing that may have been used for, but certainly important ceremonial events. We've got pottery from Ohio, and then sort of a suite of kind of exotic artifacts that have ceremonial meaning all here at Garden Creek. And so in the Woodland period, these mounds are sort of like the center points of places for major gatherings. Much of the year, they may have been kind of almost like kind of vacant ceremonial sites where you've got some caretakers kind of taking care of them, but there's not a lot of human habitation there. I did my PhD at the University of Georgia, and we have one of these vacant quarters on campus. It's the football stadium, where except for about 10 days out of the year, it's just this gaping open space on campus. But it's very important ritually. You don't just walk around the football field. You don't just go run across the Sanford Stadium with your dog or something. That's inappropriate behavior, right? That place is carefully manicured for those 10 times a year when it's actually used. So you might think about these places in that same kind of way. Okay. The Garden Creek site, the Biltmore Mound, these are part of this broader network of exchange that Southeastern archaeologists call the Hopewell Interaction Sphere. It's named for the famous Hopewell site up in Ohio. If any of you guys ever get a chance to go up into the Ohio Valley, there are these really elaborate geometric earthworks and mounds. You might have heard of Serpent Mound, for example. It's shaped like a snake eating an egg. These also date to the Middle Woodland period. And at this time, people all over the eastern woodlands are trading exotic artifacts. In North Carolina, for example, our mountains here locally in Asheville are a source for mica. Mica that was traded out and carved into elaborate artifacts like this, sort of stylized talon. People are trading in things like shark teeth, the marine shell from the coast, fine chert and obsidian from the west. Somebody whacked a grizzly bear and brought his teeth over to the east. It's like part of this exchange network. So people here in Asheville, in Canton, were part of these sort of continent-wide exchange networks. I mean, these were not isolated people. They were tied into broader networks of exchange, and these sites here in the Asheville Basin were important nodes in this bigger communication network. Does that sort of make sense? So if you think about the mounds at Biltmore and Garden Creek, what do those mean? Those were these ceremonial gathering places for people who were connected with other Native American communities all over the eastern woodlands, connected through trade all the way to the Rocky Mountains. All right, so we have evidence of that. This remarkable, 1,000-year-old history of exchange and communication right here in our backyard. At the Biltmore Estate in particular. The mound there has about a quarter of the mound has been excavated. by archaeologists from Appalachian State. Larry Kimball and Scott Shoemate worked on this back in the early 2000s, and now Alice Wright, a colleague of mine who works at App State, is still working there at Biltmore. In the Biltmore Mound, you've got, again, picture this kind of low conical rise, a lot like Garden Creek, and in the center, you've got this big post hole for what would have been, basically a giant pole going right up from the middle of the mound up to the sky. I mean, just to estimate the height here, probably a 20 or 30 foot tall, probably cedar pole running right up the middle of this mound. That architectural symbol of a pole kind of emerging from a central place up is probably describing a kind of axis mundi. It's creating a center point for the site that is drawing a line between this world and the above world and the below world. It's providing a point of reference for your cardinal directions. That's a basic idea that we're going to see carry on at these other sites. It's a fundamental idea in a lot of southeastern Indian cosmology, the idea of a center point, an above world, a below world, this world, and your cardinal directions. And so there at Biltmore, you've got one of these places. Larry Kimball at App State also thinks it's aligned with the solstices, which is a possibility as well, so some astronomical kind of observation going on there as well. This is complex behavior, all happening right here in our own backyard, 1800, 2,000 years ago. Over in my neck of the woods, on the other side of the Balsam Mountains during the woodland period, people are building these big semicircular ditches. These things are about 20 meters across, give or take. We find evidence of these circular ditch features that would have been excavated out, the earth piled up around them, creating a kind of circular or semicircular enclosure. Feasting events appear to have gone on with the creation of these features. These are kind of roughly similar to the earthworks we have up in Ohio, again suggesting some broader scale connections. So we don't get mounds out in our neck of the woods over on the west side of the Balsams, but we do have this sort of geometric earthwork construction. And if you look at this map here, kind of showing the kind of architecture we've got these low platform mounds at Biltmore Estate, Garden Creek, as well as some ditch enclosures, and these large circular ditch features over in Swain Jackson and Macon County. We're not aware of any as you get on the other side of the Nantahala Gorge, although there could be some we just haven't discovered yet. So again, about 2,000 years ago, 8,200 roughly, you have this landscape out here that is already being marked with these major, earth monuments marking the ceremonial centers. So that's happening, woodland period, 8,200, 800, give or take. These kinds of monuments are really about community, we think. There's no emphasis here on like individual leadership or individuals being placed in positions of authority, but rather these appear to be places that are kind of marking celebration and rites of community. It's a kind of community orientation. All right. Beginning about 1,000 years ago, in a time period that archaeologists call the Mississippian period, and then sort of continuing on with the arrival of DeSoto and moving into the historic period, we see a major change in the way that Native American communities in western North Carolina are using earthen monuments to mark spaces, to define their central places. And so during about 1,000 years ago, 1000 AD, we see the emergence of a kind of cultural pattern of site development and site construction that archaeologists refer to as the Pisgah phase. And for about 500 years or so, from 1000 AD to 1450, Native American communities here in the Asheville Basin and also heading over west toward Waynesville begin living in permanent sedentary villages. They're building palisades around their villages, big fortifications. Why do you build a palisade around your village? What's the purpose for that? Go ahead, yeah. What was that? Invaders. Yeah, you're worried about defense, right? Building a palisade is a real pain in the butt. It's a lot of work. You got to cut down a lot of trees and invest a lot of time and labor into building a fortification around your site. So it's not just for giggles, right? You're doing this because you're worried. Okay, so possibly there's some conflict on the landscape. We also see people building earth lodges, these big public structures that are semi-subterranean. You go into them for important ritual events and to hold council. We also see the construction of platform mounds, and I'll show you some pictures of those here in a minute. Then beginning around 1400, and sort of, we see populations kind of moving out of Asheville, maybe a little bit of a kind of demographic drop-off, and then populations begin rising on the west side of the Balsam Mountains over in Swain and Jackson County, what we think of as more traditional Cherokee territory. We get a pattern that archaeologists call the Qualla phase, where we see the construction of lower mounds and townhouses, these big public structures. And so I'll show you what these things look like. New ways that Native Americans here in our neck of the woods are marking spaces, defining their communities with the built environment. This is an artist reconstruction of the Warren Wilson site. This is an archaeological site located on the campus of Warren Wilson College, which you may have driven past while heading back and forth over towards Swannanoa. This is one of these Pisgah phase palisaded villages, so there's certainly a defensive posture here. They built a fortification around their site. You've got an open plaza area, and there's that central pole like you had back at Biltmore, that axis mundi for your site. An open plaza surrounded by domestic structures. And this sort of basic idea of an open plaza area, one larger public structure, and a series of domestic structures is widely shared across the Southeast during this time period. So people here near Asheville have a kind of shared architectural grammar with Native American communities all over the eastern woodlands, and are really defining these formal sites. We also see people building things like earth mounds and lodges. This is a photograph circa 1960 of a mound at the Garden Creek site. This is over in Canton on the west fork of the Pigeon River on Garden Creek. This mound had been excavated once and really heavily plowed by the 60s, but you can see it's still pretty big. I mean, this thing's about 10, 12 feet tall, even after lots of site destruction in the 60s. There's your 1955 Ford truck for comparison there, if you want to get a sense of the scale. But these are a big mound out there at Garden Creek, and this is an archaeological profile drawing of what the mound looked like after it was excavated, and it was in fact originally two earth lodges. So you have these two semi-subterranean structures that you would have walked into, like walked through sort of an entryway that takes you below the ground surface there into the subterranean lodge. You had a smoke hole at the top. People would have held council in here. It would have been a place for important rituals. And again, you're getting into some sort of cosmologic symbolism. Cherokee and other southeastern Native American groups have a cosmology in which you've got this world where humans live, a below world which is associated with uncertainty and disorder, an above world which is associated with order and certainty and long-term time. And so you're entering into the below world a little bit inside this earth lodge, but then you've also got your smoke rising up through a smoke hole, creating a conduit to the above world. And so you have your whole cosmology sort of compacted down into this earth lodge. We think that earth lodges, like those woodland period monuments, are really about community. They're public structures. They're places where different members of clans can enter into these places and sort of think about a council. You're making decisions by consensus, ideally. We see a change there at Garden Creek. These earth lodges are sort of decommissioned and replaced with a platform mound. So the earth lodges are covered up, and this becomes a platform for an individual chief's temple. That's a different kind of thing, right? Now you've got an individual leader, a chief, on top of this platform. So we have this sort of earth lodge to platform mound transition here in North Carolina and across much of the Southeast, where we're thinking we've got a change from more communal leadership to more individual leadership here in the Asheville Basin. That's a big deal in terms of your society going through changes. So now perhaps these mounds are not just markers of community, but also markers of like an individual chief and his family and their status. Have any of you been to the Town Creek Indian Mound in sort of south central North Carolina? When I was a fifth grader, they made us go. It was like a thing. I guess North Carolina public schools, man, budget cuts are tough. No more field trips, right? No. It's a sad state of affairs. Okay, this is a reconstructed mound with the chief's house on top of it there at Town Creek. We've got a great example of one of these down in Franklin, North Carolina. Anybody been to Franklin? That's a doable day trip. There's a French restaurant and a gas station in Franklin, right across from the mound. You should go. It's really good. It's a good day trip. Okay. This is a photograph of the Niquosi Mound in Franklin, taken circa 1898. This is one of these tall platform mounds, and so we do have people down here who are starting to kind of invest in this new kind of building where you're building platform mounds, putting your chief's house on top. These mounds are marking places, but now they're also being used as a way to sort of, quite literally elevate your chief over everyone else. I mean, we're not talking 1% and 99%. It's not that bad, right? But we do have some status differentiation going on, and that's being marked in the landscape. Okay, let's look at distribution here. Where do we find these things? During the Mississippian period, these big platform mounds are really pretty evenly distributed across the landscape. In fact, it's almost like county seats in these counties. Little bit of historical geography for you. Most of your counties in western North Carolina are defined by a major watershed, some kind of drainage, and then the ridges of surrounding mountains. And so that's a kind of ecological unit in addition to being a political unit. And I think there's some interesting continuity here where I think Native Americans recognized had a similar kind of approach to this landscape. It's sort of natural. You're sort of in these bowls up here, right? You've got your watershed bowl surrounded by your ridges. And so there appears to have been a platform mound potentially over near Swannanoa, possibly one near Biltmore. There's your Garden Creek mound. These old mounds of Gadua and the Nunyi that are now on the Cherokee, out in Cherokee on the Qualla boundary are really big. There's one in Silva, and then Niquosi and Dillard down in Franklin and Dillard, Georgia, and a couple of large mounds over in Cherokee County, sort of evenly spaced out, almost like county seats, maybe the center of sort of political and social and civic authority in these different watersheds. Does that kind of make sense? So you've gone to this pattern here where these Native American communities are marking kind of bigger territories as they're becoming more sedentary. And so these mounds, which at this point, Niquosi Mound's a good 20 feet tall, Peachtree Mound, Notley Mound, these were also 15, 20 feet tall. These are major earthen monuments that stood for centuries as a testament to the longevity of these Native American communities. Okay. Beginning around 1500 in western North Carolina, you see a shift in how these Native American communities that we can certainly call ancestral Cherokee and Cherokee communities now are approaching landscape and approaching the built environment. And we see a shift away from people building these big platform mounds like the ones at Niquosi and Garden Creek, and instead investing more energy in the construction of these townhouses, these really big public council houses, public structures. Townhouses or council houses are large, round structures. We're talking in the realm of 60 to 80 feet across, so easily as big as this room, like the Laurel Forum here, would make a pretty good townhouse actually. In the center of your townhouse, you've got a central fireplace surrounded by 4 big central support posts, and then kind of radiating out from the central fireplace, you have partitioned seating. We have an artist's reconstruction here with benches, and in some accounts, it's clear that people would sit by clan membership. So Cherokee, for example, today have 7 clans. If you're in one of these council houses, you would sit with members of your own clan. Cherokee are matrilineal and matrilocal, so related women live together. So if you had a council house, for example, at the town of Chota over in Tennessee, you'd have related women in the council house, and then they'd have their in-laws coming in to visit, right? And have a bunch of unrelated dudes living together, trying to hide from their wives in the townhouse, as guys are wont to do. And so these big council houses become the sort of new public structure. We're seeing a shift away from a focus on individual leadership, again, like this single family on top of the mound, to construction of these big council houses where, again, the focus is kind of on the community. 18th century Cherokee, we know from historical accounts, were really pretty egalitarian. They were really focused on decisions by consensus. It's really funny reading historical military accounts in the 18th century. People are trying to figure out who's in charge. And they can't get a straight answer on who's in charge because people are making decisions by consensus. When council houses were built, they probably lasted about 20 maybe 25 years in this humid southern Appalachian environment, think about the weather today. This is not good on, sort of wood and thatched buildings. And so after about 20 years, these council houses were sort of decommissioned, in some cases burned in place, and then a new council house was built right on top of the old one. And what this does over time is it creates a low mound, a reference to those older platform mounds, architecturally, and these council houses sort of slowly grow and get taller and taller as they're built up over these old mounds. This is a photograph of archaeological excavations from the Coweta Creek site down in Macon County, and you can see, even in this kind of grainy photo, these different layers of soil. When these townhouse mounds were recommissioned and reconstructed, very often there were alternating layers of red and white clay that were laid down, and so you have some red and white color symbolism at the base of these structures, and these things are kind of slowly building up over time. The mound at Coweta Creek at this site was probably at its tallest height, maybe 3 or 4 feet tall, and then has a council house on top of it. And so it's elevating that public structure up now above the floodplain. And if we look at how townhouses are distributed, and I'm borrowing a map here from my good friend and colleague, Dr. Brett Riggs at West Georgia. If we look at how these townhouses are distributed, there's a lot more of them compared to those platform mounds in the Mississippian period. We know from historical records and from archaeology that in the 5 major groups of Cherokee towns, the lower towns of South Carolina, the middle towns of the Little Tennessee River Valley, the out towns, which include modern-day Cherokee, of the Tuckasegee and Oconaluftee drainages, the valley towns in the far western corner of the state, and the Overhill towns on the other side of the mountain. Each of these towns had a townhouse. You weren't a town unless you had a townhouse, actually. And so that public structure becomes synonymous with the identity of the town. There's a lot more of them reflecting probably increasing political and social autonomy of these individual towns. You've got your own council house for making decisions. You don't have to go to the one platform mound in your whole county to look for authority. You've got your authority right in your own town there with your council house. And so we're probably seeing now folks marking the landscape in a way that also reflects more of a sense of autonomy. If you've driven around these mountain valleys and you think about how closely these things are spaced, you almost can't hit a stone. You almost can't throw a stone and not hit an archaeological site, right? I mean, like these mountain valleys are just loaded with these 17th, 18th century, 19th century Cherokee sites and their townhouses. All these little mountain communities are marked with this built environment that was built by the Cherokees, marking their places, their sacred places. Okay. And coming back to Gadua Mound again, this is that mother town. We think Gadua Mound is almost like a sort of a super townhouse. This thing is really big. This is representing the remains of a really, really large townhouse. And just to kind of position the Gadua Mound, the mound is located right here in this Ferguson Field, this big open bottom. This is Governor's Island, sort of between Bryson City and Cherokee, North Carolina. Today, if you're a member of the Eastern Band and an enrolled member of the Eastern Band, you can plant a garden there. You can grow corn there. It's communally owned in that sense by the Eastern Band. And you can think about the kind of agricultural capacity that you could have at this kind of place. And it makes sense that you'd have your big mound here, your big townhouse here, and then all this beautiful arable farmland here. From Gadua, you also have a really good line of sight with Clingman's Dome. You can see Clingman's Dome, the highest point in sort of our neck of the Appalachian Mountains. There are stories about Cherokee receiving sort of information from Clingman's Dome, important figures living on top of Clingman's Dome. And so from Gadua, you've got a direct line of sight to that place. You can also see Water Rock Knob on a clear day from there. And so if you think about this relationship between the floodplains and mounds, and then you got to think in 3 dimensions out here, guys. When you think about geography, people know these ridge lines. If you talk with people who lived in the mountains a long time, you can look at these ridge lines and know which mountains are which. And this is certainly true of Cherokee people. And so you have this great view shed there from Gadua with that other part of your world, this kind of ring of mountains that surrounds you. Okay. And this is a slide that I like to use like a hammer to try and drive a point home, and Jessica's seen it before. But here we go. This is the Parthenon. You may be familiar with it, okay? And there are some basic architectural features here that you guys will recognize, like columns and lintels, right? Do we have any columns and lintels here at Asheville on your campus? Do we have any buildings with columns? Probably, I mean, can I see one from here? You usually can on a southeastern campus, you usually can. How about in downtown Asheville though, right? Yeah. Banks, courthouses, right? So we mark important places in sort of Western architecture with columns and lintels, right? I mean, you'll sometimes see like strip mall banks that'll have a column and a lintel, right? Because that's a symbol of authority. It's a symbol of legitimacy, right? It's hearkening back to classical civilization. You know, we slap these on university libraries and on banks so that people respect them, you know, because they're easily understood symbols. You've been saturated with columns and lintels since you were a little kid. You know these are on important places. And I think for Cherokee and their ancestors, you know, these mounds it's a similar kind of architectural symbol. You know that this elevated platform, this place, is a place that is sacred, it's a place that's important, it's a place of authority, it's an easily legible symbol. And not only did Cherokees use these, but the ancestors of Creek Indians, the ancestors of Tuscarora, of Seminole Indians, use this basic architectural grammar all over the Southeast. And so the reason I hit students over the head with this slide over and over again is because I think that's something we can kind of connect to, that there are some basic architectural symbols that we can all, you know, kind of appreciate in our own culture. We've been raised to understand them, and for groups like Cherokee, these symbols carry a very similar kind of you know, emotional, intellectual meaning. You know what these things mean very quickly. It's an easily read symbol. Does that make sense? Did I hit you on the head hard enough with it? You got a take-home message? Good. See, the paper you have to write afterwards is going to be easy. You just see that. There you go. Okay. So, it's 12:43. Sweet. I'm slightly ahead of schedule. Okay, very good. This is what I thought about when I was driving home last time after I had sort of done that part of the talk, and we'd had some good conversations about, you know, the archaeology out here, but it was this second part. You know, what do these mounds mean today? You know, these are still active places on the landscape. And so I want to give you a few things to think about in terms of how people think about these places, mounds, townhouse sites today, how they're sometimes you know, used and talked about with competing narratives, how different groups sort of have a sense of ownership or stewardship over these places, and sort of what that means, and how it might connect with issues like Bear Ears Monument and the Dakota Access Pipeline. Here's a picture again of the Niquosi Mound in Franklin. I want you to try and burn this image into your brain because I'm going to show you some more recent pictures of Niquosi. So this is downtown Franklin, circa 1898. Lots of beautiful farmland around there. That mound is probably a good 20 feet tall. So try and burn that into your retina. Okay. This is a Niquosi Mound today. It appears much smaller, and that's because it's been plowed a little bit, but it's also, I've got some students there for scale, all right? It also appears smaller because the floodplain around the Niquosi Mound has been built up. In some cases, 13 or 14 feet of fill dirt have been dropped into that floodplain to raise up the level because it's in the floodplain. There were some terrible early 20th century floods when there was lots of loss of property, and so lots and lots of fill dirt was dumped on and around the Niquosi Mound. The town of Franklin, in the mid-20th century, early 20th century, bought and preserved the mound. The mound was being plowed by a farmer. They wanted to save the mound, and so they purchased this small tract of land that really just includes the mound. And today, the Niquosi Mound, and I'll show you an overhead shot here in a second, is sort of surrounded by development. So the mound itself is still there, but it's surrounded by concrete and 13 feet of fill dirt. Okay? The inscription on the state historical marker there reads as such. This mound marks site of old Cherokee town, Niquosi. A council of Sir Alexander coming with the Indians here led to a treaty, 1730. So if you just read the historic description there, you know, what's the narrative here? It's talking, there's one mention of it being an old Cherokee town, and then they talk about like the one white person historically who's associated with this, and they talk about a treaty, you know, historical written down document people can sort of, you know, understand. So there's really very little interpretation of you know, the ancestral Cherokee story or the ancestral Cherokee sense of stewardship of the site. There's some much better signage here that was put here in the 2000s that describes this as a Cherokee place, which is this sign right here. But if you just went by what the state said, you know, technically the mountain's preserved. It's surrounded by concrete. You've got one inscription about a Euro-American there, and that's it. So there's one narrative, right? There's one way you might think about this place, but there are, of course, other ways to think about it. Here's an overhead shot of the Niquosi Mound. So there it is, this tract of land, and then it's surrounded by all this development. This is kind of a wetland area. There's the Little Tennessee River. Okay, good news, bad news here, folks. Bad news, well, this is the bad news, right? Okay. The good news is this is mostly fill, which means that most of the site beneath it is actually still intact, which means that most of the important cultural features, including ancestral Cherokee graves, are actually intact under anywhere from 13 or 14 to 5 feet of fill dirt. So it's a really interesting situation in terms of preservation. You know, the mound itself is still there. Much of this village is actually probably still intact beneath tons and tons of fill dirt and this kind of concrete cap. And a few more, what else have I got here? Oh yeah, if you want to go to school for 10 years and end up wearing a hard hat and a construction vest, this may be a line of work for you. This is me monitoring excavations out near Niquosi in the summer of 2016. Now the mound is right over there. One of these gas stations near the mound was the site of an oil spill. It's this one right over here. This is a brownfield now, and Mainspring Conservation Trust, a group out in Franklin, recently got a grant, or last summer got a grant to remove all the contaminated soil from the site. And so the mound is over there. This is all fill dirt. This is 13 feet of fill dirt over top of the original site out there by Niquosi Mound. So I went to school for many years to watch a backhoe take dirt out of the ground. And what we found out there was that the original ground surface is like still intact. There's like grass from the 1950s still down there because it went anaerobic because they filled it in so quickly. There's like old Texas peat bottles and stuff down there. That's a good thing, because that means that all of that archaeological site is still underneath all this fill dirt, and then underneath about 2 feet of plowed old farm field. So the preservation prospects there are actually weirdly good, which is sort of interesting out there. So moving back, if we compare the Niquosi Mound in Franklin with the Coweta Creek site, excavated site down in Macon County, it's probably a similar layout. Here's the mound. This is probably the plaza area, like you have at Coweta Creek, and you've probably got domestic structures all around there. So if you were to sort of reclaim all this developed property, or if you could, kind of imagine all of this gone, this site is weirdly probably still intact beneath that area. Now, Niquosi has been in the papers a lot over the last 5 or 6 years. If any of you follow the local papers, the town of Franklin still owns the mound. The Eastern Band of Cherokee is very interested in buying the mound, but there have been a lot of debates and a lot of wrangling over the tribe actually purchasing the mound itself. In 2012, the town of Franklin sprayed the mound with herbicide because they didn't want to mow the grass on it anymore. They were sort of afraid they were going to damage the mound mowing the grass, and so without consulting the tribe, they sprayed herbicide on it. That was considered a desecration by the tribe, as you might imagine, and the Eastern Band demanded that they get the mound back. The town of Franklin still wants to, they still want to have ownership and stewardship over the mound. The town feels a sense of stewardship over the mound, and maybe in the Q&A we can talk about what that means for that town of Franklin to sort of feel a sense of stewardship over that mound. The Eastern Band has not been able to yet come to an agreement to purchase the mound, but they are slowly, with the sort of in collaboration with Mainspring Conservation Trust in Franklin, buying the land around it. And this conservation group, Mainspring Conservation Trust, is also buying the land around Niquosi. And so there's kind of a long-term plan to try and, remove some of that development and sort of green up this area around the mound. But this is a very politically charged atmosphere. The town of Franklin, is kind of clinging on to the sense of stewardship of the mound. The Eastern Band would like to buy it back, and frankly, it's also been used as a kind of political football in the context of conflict and debate between Macon County and the Eastern Band and Cherokee Indians over questions like, development and stewardship. Who owns the past? Much like Bear Ears Monument, there are different ideas about what these sacred site means, what they mean, and how they should be preserved. And this is happening, just an hour and a half to the west of you guys. I mean, this is real, and this is playing out right now. But I like to end my talks on a happier note, so I'm going to end my talk on a happier note down in Macon County, where in 2007, the Eastern Band, in cooperation with Mainspring Conservation Trust, then called the Little Tennessee Land Trust, was able to purchase the Cowee Mound. This is a large mound site in Macon County, which has not been developed. It's been farmed since the 19th century, but it hasn't been plowed that deeply, and so much of the village is still intact. All the graves that are out there are still intact, and the mound itself is still intact, sitting on top of this neat little tow ridge over the Little Tennessee River. And so today, the Eastern Band owns the Cowee Mound. They're doing things like planting native river cane in the bend of the Little Tennessee there, so they can take their kids out there and teach them how to do traditional crafts using river cane. Members of the Eastern Band make regular visits out there. This is back in 2007 when Chief Hicks was chief, and the warriors of Monte Gadua were out there for an event commemorating the repurchase of that land. And my friend Russell Townsend, he's a tribal historic preservation officer for the Eastern Band of Cherokee, likes to say that every time the Eastern Band and the Cherokee Nation can purchase and reclaim these mound sites, these town sites, they're rebuilding the nation one piece at a time. They're reclaiming this land that was taken from them in the context of European contact and colonialism and the treaties of the 19th century, and little by little are rebuilding the nation. And so that's I think, situations like Cowee there, that's kind of the future, I think, where groups can work together and try and reclaim these places. And again, this is not just stuff in the past, right? These negotiations, these competing narratives about how to preserve the past, who owns the past, are playing out today in our very backyard. So thanks for having me. That's what I've got. And one last thing before Q&A, I've got some recommended reading. If you want to learn more about local archaeology, Knights of Spain Warriors is sung by Charles Hudson, data produced Cherokee Women, Cherokee Heritage Trails Guidebook by my friends Barbara Duncan and Brett Riggs. That's a great book. It's an actual guidebook. You can take it with you on day trips out to the western part of the state. Drive to these towns, know where sites are. And then Travels of William Bartram is a great read if you want a picture of these mountains circa 1775. Good read. So if we have time, I'll take some questions. Yeah, sure.
So you said the church, I have two questions.
Yeah.
The purpose was for tattooing, and what were the other things you said?
Maybe, yeah. I'll go back to that slide. So out at these woodland period mound sites, middle woodland sites, you get these little chert bladelets, these beautiful finely made chert bladelets. I'm killing time while I find it. Yay, there we go. These little flint ridge chert blades, they appear to have been used for cutting soft material when you do microwear studies. So one idea is you might be processing plant materials to make medicine. That's a distinct possibility given the ceremonial context out there. There's another school of thought that they might have been used for doing some tattooing or scarification possibly. There is a tradition of tattooing among Southeastern Indians, and so you'd be making incisions and then rubbing in some kind of pigment, some kind of dye for tattooing. So
Scarification is what I didn't know if I heard that right.
yeah, and possibly some scarification. There's a book, Drawing with Great Needles, Ancient Tattoo Traditions of North America, edited by Aaron Dieter Wolf and Carla Diaz-Granados. You can check that out if you want.
And my other question
Sure.
is, how do you know that the mounds are significant? Like the ones that are 20 and 30 feet high, I can see that.
Yeah.
It's pretty obvious.
That's right. That's hard to miss. Yeah.
The Katua mound, that doesn't look like.
Yeah. Very good. So how do you know these places are significant? First of all, again, we've got that oral history. So we have we have this oral history that we know these places are important. The other thing is we know that they are the remains of these townhouses, major public structures. We actually have historical accounts from like Henry Timberlake, for example, where he describes being taken into the council house where important decisions are made. So they are the markers of your political capitals. This is like the Capitol building in Raleigh or something, And then also, keep in mind, most of these sites have been impacted by plowing, development in some cases. I mean, the Mound at Gadua was described as being, as many as like 9 or 10 feet tall in the 19th century. And so the places we see today have really suffered from development, plowing, erosion. So, I mean, they don't look as impressive on the landscape today as they do. Also, frankly, guys, out here in the southeast, I mean, look at the weather today. This is hell for preservation. I mean, we're in a moist environment. Anybody been to the Southwest? Before, like Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, cliff dwellings, it's right there, man. You walk up to it and there it is. In the southeast, our prehistoric archaeological remains are harder to see, just from erosion and from stupid pine trees dropping a bunch of acidic soil into the ground. Yeah. Good. Other questions? Yeah.
What are some of the most common things you find at these places?
What are the most common things you find? The most common artifact you're going to find is actually pottery, broken potsherds, which are actually really useful because you can use them to date sites based on the style that you find. You can do radiocarbon dating and AMS dating of pottery. These are often associated with graves. Important people in these societies were buried in or near townhouses. Cherokee have a very strong prescription against digging up graves. They're meant to stay where they are. Those graves were put there to commemorate the landscape, to consecrate those places, and so there are burials there. That's another reason why doing archaeology out here is so important in advance of like construction projects, because you really can impact graves here. Exotic pottery sometimes from other locations, stone tools like projectile points, and then ceremonial objects like shell gorgets, which are worn around the neck, and so sort of a whole suite of artifacts, both domestic and exotic. There's two really good, sort of classics, Cherokee Archaeology and Cherokee Prehistory by Benny Keel and Roy Dickens, respectively. Be two good books if you want kind of a good meat and potatoes look at some of the artifacts you find at these places. I think I saw a question over there. Yeah?
What's your favorite part about your job?
What's my favorite part about my job? Oh, that's a good one. Teaching's okay. I like teaching all right. Teaching's good. I really love excavation, especially of houses, structures. That's kind of my other research interest. I've got a book out. It's not very good, but I've got a book out, 2017, about architecture, just about architecture, if you want to check that out. But I love, how much you can learn about sort of, intimate daily life when you get a chance to take a look inside these houses. Out at the Ravensford site, there were 5 pairs of these burned 18th century Cherokee houses. This is a winter house, one of the big permanent structures folks lived in, particularly in the colder winter months. You're looking at the basin here of this house. You can see all this kind of like reddened soil here. This is burned clay. The darker streaks here are like burned pieces of charcoal. So we found, people's domestic pottery, just kind of like right there on the floor, clay pipes for smoking, areas where there have been more resharpening of projectile points and food production and consumption. So these houses provide this incredible record of daily life, and also are very difficult to excavate. I mean, we would spend sometimes 3 or 4 months excavating a single house out there, like a team of 4 people excavating a single house out there. So that's probably the coolest thing I've ever done as an archaeologist is do that kind of work. So, yeah. Other questions? I also really like working with the Cherokee community and with the Eastern Band. Again, I had kind of a classical Western education, especially coming through Wake Forest. It was still pretty old school when I came through in the in the late 90s there. And so that's radically changed how I think about archaeology. And last week we just had the Cherokee Archaeological Symposium up in Cherokee. It was September 7th and 8th. And every year members of the community, including students and elders, will come to that conference and archaeologists present, and we have feedback and back and forth with the tribal community, and that's really cool. You haven't lived until you've seen a Cherokee elder like stare down an archaeologist who did NAGPRA stuff at the University of Tennessee. I mean, very difficult conversations, very different kind of conference, a very cool thing. And if any of you are interested in going, it's every September. It's around Labor Day. I'll try and remember to email your professors here about that, so you guys can have that on your radar. Other questions? Yeah.
So when archaeologists are like looking around the mounds, do they go like inside or like under the mounds or like just on top? And if they do, how do they preserve them so well?
That's a great question. So how do you actually go about understanding these places? And today, we are really fortunate. We're sort of living in a remote sensing revolution, and so we don't have to dig anymore, especially with mound sites. So we use things like ground penetrating radar and magnetometers and gradiometers, which allow you to get, not a perfect look, but you can map things like, for example, like in one of these houses, your central clay hearth is probably going to pop up pretty clearly in GPR or mag data, and so we can actually do some remote sensing before we even have to do any kind of digging. And Cherokee also, quite understandably, are asking that archaeologists not excavate mounds unless it's absolutely some kind of salvage situation. There's some places along the Savannah River where the Army Corps has rerouted the river such that it's actually eating away mounds, and in those cases you sort of have to go in and excavate those things, because they're going to go. There's not a lot you can do. But up here in the mountains, we can do remote sensing work and really see what's underneath. Check out research by Alice Wright, W-R-I-G-H-T, Alice Wright, who's at App State. She's done some really cool remote sensing out at Garden Creek, and she's discovered through remote sensing additional mounds and enclosures that we can't even really see from the ground surface because they're so subtle. Great question. Those of you who are in school now, learn how to do remote sensing. Go take some hard science classes and do that, because that's where it's headed. Yeah, no, sorry. I'll hang around a little bit too. Thank you guys.